Expedition 44 here with Dr. Ryan, and I want to introduce you to a great friend of mine. This is Paul Lazzaroni. Paul and I have been friends sort of for our whole lives. We grew up in the same place. We're both ski hill rats, and so we have known, kind of been in the same spaces for a lot of our life. But just about 4 or 5 years ago, we were riding the chairlift up together and started having Jesus conversations, and that led to one conversation to the other conversation, and one day maybe we'll have Paul give his testimony on here, but just had been through life and was ready to kind of go the other way, turn it all to Jesus, and just go after it, and so. That shortly led to us kind of entering into a more of a discipleship relationship, and Paul at one point kind of said, "I'm coming after you," meaning as far as he's going to come after me and go after Jesus, and kind of as Paul says, follow me as I follow Jesus, and he's done that. I mean, he's a CTS seminary student, and he is on staff at one of the local churches, and just out of all the people in my circle, I think he emanates the one that is really going after the Lord. And so in our discipleship, one of the things that we are both involved in is the Tres Dias community, which most people that are watching these have at least heard us talk about it at different times. It's a 3-day retreat for men and women separately, and one of the great dynamics, I've been involved with Tres Dias my whole life. I mean, I started with rock and tech, which are the teen versions of it, when I was 16. Later became a youth pastor and was super involved with it. Our local community, I've been there since just about day one, and so many, many years of this. And one of the things that I've learned about Tres Dias, if you're familiar with it, is that spiritual directors, which are like the pastors of it, they give the same talks over and over and over. And so, as you can imagine, there are some talks in there that I've given, 30, 40 times. And the talk hasn't changed. It's scripted a little bit, and then you get to put your own things in there. But the talk hasn't changed much for 30 or 40 years. And part of the dynamics of that weekend, again, not to boast on myself, but really to boast about the kingdom dynamics, is the Tres Dias community has really figured out a lot of this stuff to figure out how to make these weekends ultra successful. Some more so than others. There's various different Tres Dias communities and communities that are like it. But one of the things that happens is people come through this and they hear a spiritual director that's been in it for many, many years, and they hear these messages, and they leave saying things like, "These are the best messages I've ever heard in my life." And the reason is because it's the same message that's been polished, I would say, by the Holy Spirit over and over and over. And the scripture often teaches that as people that teach and preach in our giftings, that we should be ready anytime. And one of those things is, you always hear pastors saying, "I'm open to the Spirit to where He wants to take me in this particular situation," but they have something ready. And personally, I live in a life where I'm always in the Word. I mean, this morning I was up at 4 o'clock, and the last 2.5 hours is my favorite time of day, where I'm just pouring through the Bible. Yesterday was Sunday. I listened to 3 or 4 different messages throughout the day, and I can never get past one verse. I could just get stuck. And so yesterday, my wife teaches at a local Christian school, and she was asking a question about Haman, and so I got into this telling her everything, and she's got to cut me off. She's like, "All right, that's way more than I needed. I just wanted to know how to pronounce his name, and I'm going through this whole thing, But then we'll get into a church service, and I'll do this. So Mondays are amazing because I've got this whole stack of stuff I can't wait to dive into. And so I have these little messages coming, but one of the things that I would encourage you guys, and I have encouraged Paul, is to come up with a message that he's sort of known for. What are your messages of life going to be? So you guys are probably familiar with my friend Steve Castle, and I would say his is destiny. And which is ironic because that's a Trace Diaz message too at the same time. But that's his best. I mean, I've probably been in a room 15 times with him now where he's taught on destiny, and it just revolutionizes people's lives. I mean, they hear it and they go, that's one of the best messages I've ever heard in my life. And I would agree. It's so fine-tuned. And so this is really like the first time that I've said to Paul, like, start crafting what that message is going to be. And every time he preaches or teaches, I kind of go back to him and say, is this it? And so he was down at a church called Five Gates in Rockford, which my heart just goes out to. Five Gates people, if anybody is listening, we love you guys. But Five Gates is a down and out community, and we have a heart for down and out community. I think Jesus had a heart for down and out community. They are my favorites. Now I have a lot of Nicodemus type friends too, and I do still spend time in that world, but boy, nothing in my mind equates like the down and out community. And so he went down and spoke to this community, and he came back, and when I talked to him, I kind of said, like, how did it go? And that question is really formed of, could this be one of them? You know, and he goes, this is it. You know, this is what. So he started talking about it, and him and I then went and wrote an article on Expedition 44 about it. And so you can read that article. This will be linked to that a little bit as well. And then he ended up preaching to our community on this too, and it was one of I'd say our most powerful nights. I mean, every night with our TOV community is super, super special and powerful, but this one in particular, like, I think I had a record number of people just after the time we spent together just say, like, tonight really, like, challenged me in terms of action. I'm gonna go make a change, make a difference, do something. And this perhaps isn't quite as deep as some of the theological things that we go. I don't really teach or preach very much, but the world is more used to that than what I normally do, and today might get a little bit more like that. But Paul, give us a little bit of introduction maybe to yourself and also to what we're talking about today and how you sort of landed there.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me on. This has been a journey, kind of to your point, and it's been a journey of really understanding a lot of the things that the Lord had placed in me, and how that's I've seen that revealed in His Word too. Some of the things that I knew were deep inside, but were kind of contrary to things that maybe I had been hearing or even been taught before. Just always didn't quite line up, and so there was something deep within, again, where I realize I have a profound love for people, and I know that we can get, I would just say, ridiculous sometimes.
Yep.
We can do things even as professed Christians that don't quite seem to line up with the Jesus narrative, and I kind of want to dive in a little bit deeper as to what may be hindering us from really living out the life, not that it's just what we're called to, but that's available to us because of the work that He's done.
I think you're right. I think about Christians that I know, and the word that also often comes to me when I think about our current culture is I know a lot of people that are really fervent. I mean, that believe that they're fervent. They lead their families fervently. They serve. They work in churches. They lead small groups. They do all of this stuff. We often use the word, are you all in? And I think a lot of people think that they're all in, but then, you know, I would sometimes question that because of what you said. Like, you get this incredible, passionate pursuit of the gospel, but at the same time, the word I think is best is they're just way too entangled with the world. They're way too entangled with the fallen spiritual beings being sucked in by, you know, principalities and powers. They routinely make decisions that way, and they don't even realize it. You know, they're just stuck in that world. It's almost like an excuse of everybody else is doing it. There's not a lot of people that are posturing or are demonstrating what it really looks like to walk with Jesus. And so when you are in a room with somebody that makes decisions over and over towards the kingdom, when every decision comes from a perspective of what is the best kingdom decision, it looks a lot different than what a lot of things do. And so as Christians, we kind of find ourselves in this murk. Sometimes we're stuck knee deep in mud and we're trudging through it, while other times we're just in this amazing, consistent progress journey. And usually at our TOV group, I keep coming back to, like, that's what we're shooting for. We want to be surrounded by that. But I don't think that that's the normal or the everyday church culture. I think the everyday church culture, especially, it tends to be the larger church you're in, the more that you're caught up in this, is that you just go and you might listen to the gifting of the one or the message or something like that, and you come home and you struggle to really make it impact every day of your life. And so really what we're talking about today is, what does it look like that you harness every decision for the kingdom? What does it look like that throughout the day you wake up in the morning, you say, Lord, today every decision I want to be postured towards your kingdom. Every part of my time, every part of my thought, all of my space. We talk about sacred space a lot. All of my space needs to image Jesus in my life. And how do I make those kind of decisions every day?
Yeah, and so who better to study than Jesus? And for me, one thing I realized that a lot of the stories that I had read about him, they were incredible. The way that he interacted with people, the types of things that he stepped into, and specifically his relationship with the Father. But I had to put the pieces together. Well, how did he get to that point?
Yeah.
Because a lot of what we know about him was formulated before any of these things were written. There was times of equipping and strengthening that had been done really behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Before a lot of these things are recorded down. And so one of the stories that really caught my attention was right in Matthew 4. It's Matthew 4:1, when Jesus was led by the Spirit of God into the wilderness. This followed right after his baptism.
Yep.
That caught my attention. That is, although as soon as he stepped into this obedience, he was led into this space.
One of the things that you kind of keyed in on is that we don't know everything about the life of Jesus, and people just, in a great way, want to desire more and more and more. And so oftentimes people jump into extra biblical material, and I think that extra biblical material is a great thing to sort of take some things that were left undone in the scriptures and then verify, at least I look at them as commentaries, verify what the people in that day were thinking, and does that line up with the same way that I would read it? Of course, the narratives were typically written to a specific audience, and you and I are not that specific audience, yet they are still for us, and our goal is to try to interpret first how they would have been interpreted to that audience, and then figure out how to apply it to me. And so as we're looking at that, and you look at, like you said, Matthew 4:1, Jesus is led into the wilderness to be tempted. I want to know what else was going on. I want the backstory. And, if you've read, let's see, the first This Is the Way book, there's a little paragraph in there that kind of says, like, one of the things that I hope and I dream for is, I think when we get to the heavens, everybody always is like, what are we going to be doing in heaven? Like, how is it so much fun? How is it so joyful? Like, I'm a Star Wars freak, obviously, writing a book called This Is the Way. And one of the things in Star Wars is that you walk into the middle of this story, the very first one in whatever year that was, 1976, the first Star Wars. You're walking into what we now know is the middle of the story, and you don't have the pieces to go with the rest of that. You just have to figure it out. And the Bible is sort of very, very similar to that. We don't have the rest of them. So I always joke that I hope those are the movies we're watching in heaven, or perhaps the forward-speaking, movies that are playing out that we're part of, you might say. But there's so much that we don't have. So you go back to this incident in the wilderness, and you have to ask the question, what's going on? And it seems to be what we have a hard time with is that Jesus is fully human, yet he's also God.
Yeah.
And that's really the struggle here. And a lot of times when we read Jesus stories like praying in the garden and, the disciples don't last, a couple hours and he's praying all night or something like that, I think we're always trying to size ourselves up with the disciples. Like where do we sit? Where do we land? How holy are we? Things like that. Do we need the Torah more than the people that it was written for, or have we gotten past that, And so we're always asking these questions, but what Jesus does in the wilderness seems superhuman. It seems like as much as I have gone through fasting and persevered through different stuff, this is something that I have a hard time doing.
Yeah, and this was the big wrestle for me too. Like you said, it kind of will compare to where the story is in that moment, but not realize how much probably had happened before this point. And I think that's what caught my attention. I think many of us probably really know this story well, but just to consider sometimes 1 day, 3 days, or 5 days of fasting might be a tall task to ask. Although scripturally, we're called to do that. But 40 days and 40 nights, I had to wrestle with. Well, one, do I really believe that he was fully human? That he laid aside his godness throughout his entire human existence here, and then two, if he did, is this really possible? And not only that, realizing much of the story was at the end of those 40 days and 40 nights. That's really what caught my attention in this story. And I had to ask what had happened then if he really did this, if he walked through this type of obedience, and not only that, was victorious at the end of it, what had happened to get him to this spot to be able to walk out this type of journey and faithfulness to the Lord.
So just to be clear, I think that we know that Jesus was fully human. So we know that when we go through hard things, that's what Jesus was going through. So this is a picture. There's a few of these in the Bible of this is a moment where we can look at the life of Jesus, and when we're trying to size ourselves up, can we do this? The answer is yes, we could. Are any of us there? No, I don't think I know anybody that could do the 40-day stint that Jesus did in the wilderness. But there's a lot of truths tied into this. I love it that the spiritual beings were there to minister to Jesus after he did this. And I look in my life and I kind of think have I ever been so depleted for the kingdom of God that angels came and ministered to me? I cringe even saying angels, but you guys get that. But you know what I'm saying? We could get there. It's sort of an archetype of humanity that we can attest to. And I think part of this message of this story and knowing that Jesus is fully human is the answer is yes, we could get there.
Yeah. So what I realized though is when we read that word tempted. Now we're going to get into that a little bit later, but there was a tempting here. And I also believe that there was a testing as well, which we'll see both of these, and they're both different. One is good and one is bad here. But again, getting back to Jesus' humanity, to be able to see this to the end, to have it fulfilled, there was a lot of equipping, there was a lot of discipline, there was a lot of discipling that had to have come up until this moment. And so what we see is a tempting by Satan, but also a testing by God. And again, one was evil and one was good.
And this is that constant thing. We talk about this a lot. And it obviously has influenced my life and many people's lives greatly, in that we named our church community TOV, and that the TOV and the Rohr, the which one are you going to choose? And that's really what today's message is largely about, is every day we have opportunities. Are we going to be influenced by the TOV going towards what is of God, or are we going to be influenced of the Rohr, of what is of the world, what is of the fallen, nature of the spiritual principalities and powers? And this story is exactly what that's talking about. And so we go a little farther in this. I'll just read Matthew 4:6. This is the testing, the tempting. And so basically what's going on is you have this has a little bit of a Job divine court scene to it. It basically has the figure that in the Old Testament we'd kind of call the challenger, the accuser, the Hasatan, in the New Testament, it kind of takes more of a proper name of Satan. And so we have Satan going and finding Jesus, and God seemingly allowing his son going through this test. And so from Satan's perspective, it's a temptation. From God's perspective, we call it a test, although test as we work through this might not actually be the best word. We'll get to that. But the kind of the vividness of this picture is in Matthew 4:6. It says, "And said to him, If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." And so the first thing to kind of point out here is that what's going on here is Satan is doing something that we still see him doing on a regular basis today. And I think that this is the number one entanglement of the world that I was just talking about, is that he takes something that seems of God, but he just twists it just a little bit. And that is the deception of the evil one that pierces us so much, is that if he can just get us to go a little bit down this road, slightly off course of what God says, then he's going to be successful in pulling us the rest of the way. And so that's exactly what he does with Jesus. And I don't know if you realize this the first time you hear this, but he's misquoting this text. And so, he leaves out little parts of it. And, in some ways, sometimes people have said, well, Jesus did that. Jesus doesn't always quote things. In fact, that's what my dissertation was about. Did Jesus quote exact things? Did he leave it out a little bit? Is Satan doing the same thing that Jesus often does? And the difference is that Jesus was actually, in most cases, quoting the scripture that they would have been reading regularly, which is the Septuagint. You can read my dissertation if you want to, but almost every time it goes back to a quote of what everybody was familiar with. And so, which again speaks to that down and out person. That's the Septuagint copy. The higher ups weren't necessarily reading that. And so Jesus is speaking to the average person, and that's really what's going on there. But Satan misquotes this, and he alters it, and Jesus doesn't correct him here. He just kind of keeps going, and he kind of lands with these tests from Jesus are sort of strictly forbidden. So throw yourself down. It's got a lot of implications. The first thing that I really want to point out about this of how it affects us is that we often as Christians, and this kind of makes me sad, but often as Christians, the number one thing that we pray, when you hear people pray, it's genie in the bottle prayers. It's, you say, hey, we'll have kids over to our house, and I'll say, Matthew, can you pray for our food today? And it's almost always a genie in the bottle prayer. Lord, give us this, give us this, give us this. And it's such a materialistic, modern American way to pray, that we think God just wants to do all this stuff. And actually, when you come back to this, that's the first note of this is Satan is essentially saying, just ask God for what you want and he'll give it to you. And Jesus's response is basically saying, that's blasphemy towards the Father. Yet when you look at this and you size it up with our prayers every day, isn't that the way that most of us pray on a regular basis? I mean, that is the primary way that we pray, is that we demand God for things. And sometimes we even say something like, if it be your will, then do this. But what we're really saying is, Lord, we want you to posture your heart towards my heart.
Yeah. And even to take it a step further, to even step into the authority that we've been given as kingdom children, we'll still do that. And that's very similar to what Satan had done. It's very what can sound like kingdom authoritative type language.
Yeah.
To where we demand the things of God's kingdom into this earth, but it still has that selfish motive behind it.
And you're right. This is hard because, of course, the Bible also says you have not because you ask not.
Right.
And so there's obviously a sense in this where God is asking us to pray for these things of the kingdom. And if we, in the circular Hebraic way of thinking, that is, if we now get into exercising this, we believe it, we live this way, and we do it, then God's going to meet us circularly there, and we're going to become that. That's a Psalm 37:4, delight yourself in the Lord. If you do things that delight the Lord, eventually you are going to delight the Lord. And so, this is a hard one, but again, the implications here, you kind of have the name it, claim it varieties of religious belief that are, I would call, temple throwers. They're people that are placing demands on God and kind of linking that to spiritual maturity, that if they have a relationship with God, then God will answer it. And this is hard because I look at Moses. He's probably the one that this comes into the most. I mean, some people have had the relationship to wrestle with God, and I often say things like this, that like, if you are not devout to the Lord, like, you really don't have any right to ask anything of the Lord. Like, if you're not in his space, if your heart isn't postured there, like, your prayers shouldn't be asking God of anything, because you don't have that place on the throne, so to speak.
Yep.
You have to just give it to a sovereign God. And like, I have a hard time ever praying to ask for anything because I don't want to get in the way of the will of God. And I'll go back to the Moses story. So Moses, you might remember, God brings the people out of the Red Sea. We're going to talk about this. This is actually very much where we're landing, but I'm jumping the ship here. We're going from the back, the front back here. And so he gets to this point. They do all these miraculous things out of the Lord. They get here. Moses goes up, and God basically says, "I'm going to restart." He goes kind of back to the flood, the Genesis 6 thing, and he goes like, I took these people out. I personally showed them. I did everything for them, and they are not going to honor me. They are not going to serve me. Like, I'm just going to start over. And what happens is amazing, because Moses then pleads with the heart of God to not do that start over, to keep his people. And what's amazing is that God goes along with this. Is that God says, all right, Moses, we're going to do this. And I always wonder what would have happened if Moses would have just let God do what God was going to do. It sounded terrible. I'm going to destroy these people and we're going to start over. But what happened is that Israel was supposed to renew the earth in their generation. I mean, within their generation, the earth was supposed to be destroyed. And because Moses pleaded with God and Israel was saved, we're now 4,000 years removed, and the earth still hasn't been renewed.
Yep.
Would it have been better to stick to God's ways? That is the million-dollar question when it comes to that. Moses essentially used the power of prayer to sway the heart of God, yet was it best? And that's the answers that we are never going to have the answers to. When we get to heaven, this is going to be a great coffee shop conversation. So, this is going to be, the talk show with Jesus and Moses sitting up there. So, you did this. How'd that pan out for you? How'd it work out?
And so it was in that Jesus story where, again, what the Israelites didn't do and what Moses wasn't able to see fulfilled, Jesus seemed to fulfill a lot of this.
Yeah.
And so we focus on these end interactions after those 40 days and 40 nights, but it was that middle story that really has caught my attention, and also brings it back to this story with Moses, with the Israelites. And so there was just a huge parallel there. What we saw was Jesus, he was entered again into this wilderness season right out of baptism.
Yeah.
And this was very similar to the Israelites' journey out of the Red Sea.
Yes.
This was a coming out of an old life, a chaotic life. This is our symbol of baptism, where we're released from this old life and we're entering into this new, holy, devoted life that the Lord had intended for us. however, right into a wilderness season. Like, what is this?
Yeah.
Why did the Lord do this?
So let's look at that. Why don't we just start out giving a little bit of a summary of the Red Sea and what happened there, because this is a parallel. I mean, it's sort of a foreshadowing of what happened there, and Jesus is going to sort of show a better way to look at that.
Yep. So obviously we know that the Israelites had been enslaved in Egypt, and this was a 400-year stint.
Long time.
This was a big deal.
Yeah. Enough to change your culture over and over and over. And I don't know if you've ever thought of this, but America, 1776, 2024, we're pretty young. And so you look at just that, and then you look at 400 years. Essentially 400 years in the Bible. I don't know how much you know about numerology. That was the period of silence between the Old and the New Testaments, which wasn't very silent. A lot changes in 400 years. So from the time that the Bible was finished writing, when we read the last passages to the time of Jesus, you're kind of like, whoa, what happened? What went on? Like, it seems like the whole culture changed.
Yep.
And it did.
Yeah.
And that's what happened over the 400 years going on here as well.
So the Israelites have been crying out to God, and He had heard their cries, and this is where we saw the plagues happen, and eventually the release of the Israelites from Egypt through the Red Sea.
And we've talked about this before, but boy, this is a Deuteronomy 32 worldview war going on. It's basically, the powers that be against God saying, I'm going to come back and get my children.
Yeah.
And he goes to war against them, and we see this over and over.
So the Red Sea split. The Israelites move forth out of the Red Sea.
Yep.
2 million plus people, which is just staggering. This is a huge deal.
Yeah.
Onto the shores of the wilderness,
Yeah.
into this wilderness type season. And so to your point, there is this in the physical sense, the entire Egyptian army is swallowed up into the Red Sea. Now they seem to be set free from the oppression that they just came out of. However, to the point that they had been doing things to the culture of slavery,
Yep.
to the culture of Egypt.
Very ingrained in them.
This is all they knew.
Yeah.
This is what they knew. So if we see that, it would make sense that there had to be some training, some equipping, just some undoing of ways of thinking and living.
And this is really important because when they're coming out of Israel, like we said, or coming out of Egypt, they're so ingrained. We call that in slavery. I mean, and that's sort of where we are right now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we haven't been in modern America for 400 years, but like just my lifetime generation is enough to know that we're enslaved in the ways of modern America. And there's a lot of things going on here. And so in the Bible, I think most of you are familiar with this. The Bible Project did several videos that kind of talk about this. Michael Heiser gets into a lot of it too. But water often signifies chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the beginning, the Spirit of God is kind of hovering over the waters of the deep. It kind of gives us a description of things going on. And it's not, water is a chaos monster in a sense. So it's not necessarily bad of itself. It's not TOV or Ra, but it's an opportunity that either one of those things can happen. And so we kind of have this, dark controlled, maybe violent, unpredictable things that can happen. And it's a picture of how far you can go down that road. Yet it can also be used for the good. And so people in an ancient world sort of feared water because of this.
Mm-hmm.
There were sea creatures living in it, the Leviathan, that they didn't know if they were good or bad or if they could trust, and sometimes they were misrepresented as being used by the evil world and things like that. They worship some of the sea monsters and things of the cosmos get into this and all that kind of way. But we get a picture of the Red Sea and maybe even of the flood that's going to tie in later with baptism. And that's kind of a weird thing, especially with the flood. So many people question like how God could kill so many people through the flood, or he says he's going to destroy basically the whole nation and start over. Greg Boyd, I think, is the best person to answer some of these questions. He's got a book called The War. I think The War God is the name of it, and a lot of his works kind of touch on the wrath of God and, putting a better perspective on those. But I can't leave this one alone. I think before we get any further, we sort of just have to quickly address that. And this is a hard one to reconcile in the Old Testament. In fact, at the beginning of the show, I was saying how I got stuck on a few things, and one of the things over the weekend that I sort of got stuck on is, that God in the Judges is going to come down and speak to the judges and say, I'm going to raise you up, threshing floor, this person cowering in the actually wine press, which was much smaller than a threshing floor. He was hiding, and God appears to him and say, I'm going to make you great, and I'm going to do this so that you can basically go avenge, and the biblical word is very close to smite or annihilate these people. How could God do that? Did God command Israel to go and do that? I mean, some theologians say the intent was God was going to fight their battles for them. They were just going to hang out and sort of eat popcorn and watch, and God was going to go do all this fighting for them. Boyd addresses that one, that view. But we get into this, and one of the ways that you might reconcile it, and this is just a view, whether you want to hold it. There's several good views that make sense here, but I feel like I need to introduce something. If you're watching this video going, how can you serve a God that is one of genocide, basically, that wants to kill all these people in the Old Testament? What's very interesting is Jesus really ties into this story hugely and in so many ways. And so you might be familiar with this, that in the Old Testament, when they would go to war, and particularly when they were successful, one of the post-battle things that they would do is they would go bury all the fallen. And it was both their fallen and the other side's fallen. This is sort of where we get funerals from. And they would erect altars. And the altars would be what they would pray for. And essentially, this is also where the Catholics pray for the dead now. If you ever wondered where that came from, it was basically that they would pray that in God's mercy, there might be another plan, that their enemies might be reconciled in the afterlife as their brothers. And that sounds a little crazy until you really follow the scriptures devoutly. And again, this is one of those things that Paul was talking about earlier. Are you going to be open to some of the things that the Bible says that is outside of your normal constructs? And this is one of those things, so don't throw me under the bus yet, just hear me out. But essentially, if you follow like an Apostles' Creed version of Christus Victor, of what happened, part of the atonement of the cross is that Jesus is essentially going to go into the underworld and regain the keys to life. And what happens when he does that is he seems to also preach to the degenerates. And so it looks like those people are given another opportunity. And so if you go back now to all those that have fallen, is that merciful? In the flood, it's drowning, and some people say, oh, drowning would be the worst way to die. It actually happens in, scientists tell you the exact amount of time, but it's like 30 seconds, It's about as merciful as it gets. Sometimes when I talk about PSA, I talk about, the worst person that we've ever had is Hitler because he killed all these people in a gas chamber, and we talk about, eternal conscious torment and, tormenting forever and ever and ever. That doesn't sound like a merciful God of the Bible. Most of these things, I believe, were imminent, quick deaths, and I don't believe God sees the doorway. We're going to talk about this in a minute. The doorway or the threshold to death in the same way that we view it. And so I'm not necessarily saying that the Bible outright teaches in the Old Testament that people were given another chance, but I am saying that it might. It opens the door to that way of thinking, and that is if you're into not pluralism, but universal reconciliation, which I don't hold, but I'm bringing that out, that if things were a foreshadow in the Old Testament of the way they're going to be in the New Testament, and Jesus did go back and preach to the unregenerate in the Old Testament, and they were given another chance, all of a sudden their merciful death looks pretty merciful in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And so, because they're going to be given another chance and a better chance, and perhaps that's going to happen forward thinking. And that's what universal reconciliationists believe, is that they're also, in the same way that the Old Testament, they were given that chance, people in the New Testament, when they awake from their sleeping at the judgment, there will be a judgment, but there will be a chance for them also to be redeemed. Now, the reason why I struggle with that, and I'm not sure I can go there, is because in the Old Testament, they didn't have Jesus. Jesus fulfills this. And so when Jesus fulfills this and goes into the places of the underworld and does that, it's the first time that they get the revelation of Jesus. We all already have the revelation of Jesus. And so that doesn't mean it can't happen, but it doesn't mean that it's going to happen. It's just when we go back and we say we don't have all the cards, that's how we started this video, is there's a lot we don't know.
Yep.
And this is the one of those things kind of left undone. But when we start talking about slavery and freedom and chaotic waters and all these kind of things, this is one of those conversations that comes up. God's ways are higher than our ways. Maybe we should just leave them alone.
Yeah. And really, it does, knowing a lot of that and wrestling through some of that, even some of the concepts of hell, when we look at the waters that way, could this be, or could what we know as hell just be how bad life can be outside of knowing God and a relationship with Him? That the waters signifying this unknown, and again, this chaotic and dark and unpredictable, really miserable place that we can find ourselves in life. And I don't know about you, but I've been there before.
Yep.
Where my decisions have been completely void of any relationship with Him.
Yeah.
And that honestly was the most confusing spot that I could ever find myself.
And we lightly say this, that like, oh, you're in hell right now, but like there is a lot of truth to that. You make these decisions, you're on the threshold of, good and bad, TOV and Rohr, and if you continually make decisions that go towards Rohr, guess where Rohr points, and there's parts of that along every step of the way.
Yep. So we do often overlook just really the beauty what was to be found in this new journey of the Israelites into the wilderness. Again, we go back to the fact that it was 400 years. That was a long time. They're going to think in accordance to the way of the culture that they had been in.
Yep.
It's just, this is how this stuff happens. And again, not to rabbit trail, but this again could be where we get generational sin, or at least that concept. It may not be a spiritual thing that's handed down. It's a simple way of thinking and doing life that could be contrary to the way of the Lord. And this is where the Israelites had been. So this journey into the wilderness, ultimately designed by God, and had it been lived out that way, was a beautiful thing for them.
And one of the things you said last night was you quoted Psalm 136:12, and it says, with a mighty hand and outstretched arm, His love endures forever. And there's a very good chance that was sort of chanted during this Red Sea moment. And we talk about, the death and everything. And I love the Bonhoeffer quote of everybody must die. It's not an exact quote. That's pretty much what he said. And so what he's meaning by that is that Jesus' way, in the Old Testament, this might foreshadow what I was talking about, the death being there, is that through this water, it's a picture of baptism.
Yep.
That we all have to die to our old selves to be totally recreated in new life. And when the Israelites were crossing over the Red Sea, that was one of the first pictures of baptism. You might even say the flood was similar to that. And although we have a hard time with those things, essentially that's what every Christian believes today. We don't live this way, but that's what we believe. That's what we teach and preach, is that through those waters of baptism, we are completely dead to our old selves, and that when we arise, what we're saying is we're going to make decisions that align with the Lord rather than the Rohr.
Yeah.
We're going to choose TOV rather than Rohr, and we're going to be devotional to do that. Now, the problem is, that was what was supposed to happen from the Red Sea forward, and it didn't.
Yeah.
And today, a lot of theologians would say we're not in any better place. You know, we've got Jesus. It should have been redeemed. We should be on the way upward trajectory. I mean, our line should look like this of upward trajectory, but we might actually be going downhill instead, because we're supposed to be making these decisions for TOV because we've come out of the water, yet we're stuck in the raw.
Yeah. And again, we go back to what you said earlier, even with the creation story, when God's Spirit was hovering over the waters of the deep, he brought forth land. This was the first piece of kind of bringing peace to what was chaotic, or order to it as well. And again, the flood narrative with Noah. And again, here, there seems to be these opportunities for a brand new way of living coming out of the waters of chaos.
That's very important.
And so, again, when we go back to the beginning of this video, one thing I said, like, I love people. I know that the Lord loves his people, and his people had always been designed, and we have an opportunity to represent the goodness of who he is. This is the opportunity that the Israelites had in this story, that they had been designed for this. The Lord knew it. He ordained him to do it, and this was now their opportunity to step into something like this. Had what he had given them in this season, the gifting of what we would call the Levitical law.
Yep.
This is just his ways of doing life, bringing forth his kingdom into the earth. It would have been a beautiful picture in this. So again, the Levitical law was a beautiful thing, but I think that this is where often we get tripped up, is to move over the fact that there's equipping that needs to happen. This always goes back to the Romans 12:2 piece about do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
So you have people that were 400 years of learning to do things wrong. Now, I don't know if you ever put this together. Numbers are important. It took 400 years you're always learning something. You're always being discipled one way or the other. So for 400 years, they've been discipled towards the Ra. Literally, that's the name of the gods, the Ra, and so they've been discipled for 400 years. Now, what happens is they were supposed to be delivered into the new world. Now, God's way, this is really important, was that it wouldn't take any time. Did you catch that in the scripture? God's way was that he believed that they were just going to go occupy. They were going to be in a land of milk and honey and grapes as big as your head. And it was going to happen like this. Yet when there was a step back, second best or plan B might have been, instead of taking 400 years, the Israelites, if you do the math, should have been wandering in the wilderness to equal the Ra for 400 years. Yet God says, I'm going to do that 10 times quicker. I'm going to do it in only 40 years. That's a huge sign of grace and mercy.
Yeah, it sure is. And I think we could even argue that possibly could this have been almost even 40 days type of thing, which talk about tying back into Jesus' experience into the wilderness.
Yeah.
But we also know, again, that this was a beautiful thing. God's way of doing things was good. These laws that we were giving him, again, it was not just good for them, it was also a great representation, or it should have been, of his kingdom. And again, could this have been just simply 40 days? But what we don't need to miss is this equipping period.
So what the picture is when people come out of the water, I often say they need to be healed. God's way is immediate.
Yeah.
I mean, God's way, you and I have seen it. But we both work with a lot of people that have ministries of overcoming things.
Yeah.
And so I see it that God's way is to totally heal you of this right now, right then. That's always what I pray for, that you will just be healed. That I've seen people that have smoked their whole life, and all of a sudden, like, they get in the water and they come out and they don't smoke anymore. Like, they've been redeemed. But I also see where people need the 40 days, maybe the 40 years, and God forbid, maybe the 400 years.
Yeah, yeah. So, although, and spiritually too, even in the New Testament, we see that spiritually, for those, if we've decided to come back to this all in Jesus way of living and just give our entire lives to this, that there are some spiritual implications that does happen right now. However, the mind doesn't always catch up that quick.
Yeah, yeah. Boy, there's so many places you can take this. In the article, we talk about cities, and I think I'm just going to leave that one undone. You can go read the article for that. But let's kind of get back into kind of that classroom idea of going back to Matthew 4. Let's shift from the Red Sea and talk about Matthew 4. Get back to the test, the tempt. What was Satan trying to accomplish? What was God trying to accomplish?
Yep. So we know that Jesus had made this statement, I am the way, the truth, and the life, that nobody comes to the Father except through me. Again, what he's also declaring here is the blood that he poured out on the cross. You talked about this earlier.
Yeah.
There's huge spiritual implications with that blood, but it also gave us incredible victories in this life if we so choose to receive what he had given us. However, we are still in desperate need of the training and the equipping piece. But when we go back to the word that was in Matthew 4:1, again, Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. So this word tempted is parazo. Am I saying that correctly there?
Pretty close, yep. Little roll to the R.
Yep. But what that means is to make proof, to attempt, to test. However, in this context, this is actually a negative form of this word, meaning that Satan was using this as a way to lure. This is a luring type of mindset.
So the one I think of is that you probably all know, you got this memorized, is James 1:2-4. It says, my brothers and sisters, consider it nothing but joy when you fall into the sorts of trials, because you know the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect effect, so that you will be perfect and complete, not deficient in anything. So the question, up on this one, and actually in this word, it's a little bit, it's dokamion, so it's going to be a slightly different word of testing what is approved, kind of the positive version of what you're saying. And both of those words are contronyms. They can both have a negative and a positive word. You see that throughout Scripture, that both of them are sort of used that way, but that's the TOV and the Rohr. That is the contronym of everything in Scripture. The blessed and the cursed is, are you going to let this be a TOV aspect of your life, so walking towards what is good, what is Jesus now, or are you going to, let this be the negative part of it? And so when we look at these two things, I want to be clear that the devil, Satan, whoever you call him, and God aren't in cahoots over this. Mm-hmm. That's very important to state, because sometimes people, when they go back and they read the divine council scenes in Job and the things like this, again, you have to, and we don't have time to really get into all of the timeline of all of this, but that's not what's going on in Job. That's probably a pre-fallen spiritual version of perhaps Satan, but maybe a different accuser. I think that was actually a spiritual gift in the heavens of some would sort of have that gifting to play in the red team. Churches don't like to use that spiritual gift today, but it's still, I think, very important. So I'll just leave that one on the shelf, and that's another video for another day. But you get into this, and what's happening is God's way is one way, and that is to disciple through this temptation, that we're going to be made better because we step into the TOV. Satan's way is that he wants to destroy us through the same circumstances as he does that. So this is a great picture of, we're going through the same thing, and God's way is here, which looks very similar to what Satan is trying to accomplish over here. And what's the difference? That's really where I want to land here.
Yep. And so both the story with the Israelites and the story with Jesus here, there's the two things going on. You keep alluding to this dualism type mind understanding of way of seeing this, and there's the tempting and there's the testing, and the one could be raw, it could be bad, and that's what Satan is after, and the other, the testing, is a good thing. The Israelites were in the middle of this. Jesus was experiencing this as well, both a tempting and a testing. The testing from the Lord is a good thing. This is an equipping piece. And we know that God doesn't tempt. Again, James later in that same chapter says that that when tempted, no one should say that God is tempting me.
Yeah.
For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. And so, although he won't do that, he can still use even what Satan wants to use to lure us away as a testing piece of our character. We even when James first stated that, we have a tendency to focus on the trial piece,
Yep.
like just look at it in a negative way. But if we start to look at these seasons in life, this wilderness season, as a possible place where God really wants to meet us, it can be a beautiful thing.
Yep.
This is what he wanted to offer the Israelites. This is what Jesus realized and stepped into in this moment.
There's a lot of different takeaways. Again, like we keep getting on these squirrel trails with this kind of things, but I think one of the first things to kind of hit is that this should be a one-way street with God. It seems like we're always almost testing God, and there's lots of Psalms that talk about people doing that to God, and we don't have any place for that. Our place isn't that we do that with God. The place is that God is discipling us. Mm-hmm. It's the one-way street. And Paul and I live in a dual discipleship world, even though like I started out as, the master and he was the apprentice. Like 5 years later, it doesn't really look like that at all. I mean, we live on a very dualistic pattern where he's encouraging me on a daily basis. I'm encouraging him. You guys are very familiar with Matt Muzakis, my co-host of most of these films on Expedition 44, and same thing. Like it started, I was his doctoral advisor, and 7-8 years down the road from that, it looked very different. And that is the way of this. But oftentimes, again, we want to tell God how it's going to be. And this is what I come back to that prayer early on. Moses sort of did that, and it really was it the wrong decision. Like we're never going to know that, but like these times where we try to dictate, maybe through prayer or through something else, our ways are better than God's, are really going to find us in some not so good spaces. And that's really where we're going with the rest of this conversation. As we've talked about wilderness, and not everybody realizes this, but wilderness is God's space. Mm-hmm. And so even though the Satan figure in the New Testament, Matthew 4, was in the wilderness, it was, some people equate that to Job because the challenger in Job was in the divine places in that too. But don't be so quick to just say they were the same type of things. And so the wilderness, you have to remember, even though it's God's space, that was Eden, that was what God designed. The whole earth had pictures of Eden, so to speak. So the wilderness might be a picture of Eden, but it's given over still to the world. And so it's this weird space because it's neutral space. It was space that once belonged to the Lord, but now it was sort of given over in a Deuteronomy 32 sense of losing these things. And the space should have been regained by the Israelites, yet it never was. Mm-hmm. And so now with Jesus, this is day one of basically doing what the Israelites fell short of doing, is reclaiming. And where does he meet his Father? In the wilderness, in the Garden of Gethsemane. So that's where it's not the cities, and again, the article has something to this effect, but the wilderness becomes the classroom or the worldly place where you're going to learn to re-walk in the garden.
And this is where we struggle.
Yes.
This is such a challenging space for us. Another word to describe this would be a liminal space.
Yep. And
liminal in the Latin, it means threshold. Most of you know what a threshold is. In fact, if you've left your home today or you walked into work or classroom, wherever it is, you've walked over a threshold. It's a space and a doorway it's not out and it's not in. I'm not where I was. I'm not where I'm supposed to be.
You're in transition.
We're in transition. However, I think the biggest challenge that we face in this is we don't know what the other side is going to look like if we choose to follow God and when we're going to get there.
Now we see these liminal spaces in a lot of different places. So the water of baptism is probably your number one transitional place. And like I said, when you come out, the ideal is that you're going to be completely healed and on that road. But because of reasons unbeknownst to most of us, I've spent most of my life trying to figure this out, like why I can pray for healing over one person, they're healed like that, and another person seems to take a long time. But again, I come back to what this video is about, is it's over my pay grade. This is the Lord's stuff. Like my faithfulness is I just need to give it to the Lord and make devotional decisions and let him take care of the rest. And that's really where we struggle. And so that's the number one liminal space. But then you also have after that, and some people might have more than others, but you're going to continually be stuck in these wilderness liminal spaces. And the fact that it's wilderness and that Jesus has already happened 2,000 years ago means that we have the advantage. Is that we should be one step closer to the TOV of the wilderness spaces than the Rohr of the wilderness spaces. Yet in the materialistic, entangled world that we live in today, sometimes I question that.
Yeah. And when it comes to that, whether it's here in America and the way that we live in our culture, there is definitely something that we seem to be missing when it comes to the power and the beauty that God's representatives were created to live out. I mean, we say it, we may even wear clothing that says that, but is there fruit that is being seen in our lives that are representatives of being God's children in it too? And could it be that it's in these spaces that he wants to build this type of faith within us and walking out this type of spiritual authority that he's given in it?
And in one sense, it's really easy to be hard on us because it's all been revealed to us. We've got the scripture, we've got Jesus, we've got what else do we need?
Right.
You know, it's like we should be living in these tight TOV communities where, like, when you get out of line a little bit, like you got six brothers, like right there going, "What are you doing?" You know, like reel you back in. But the other side of the fence is there was no better time to come out of the water than Israel. And look how miserably they failed. So I'm not using that as a crutch or anything else, but I'm just saying they literally walked with God. God was the cloud bringing them here, and they were walking with God, almost a return to Eden, and they still failed so miserably.
Yeah, it's such a gift that we have. Again, we go back to God's mercy, that this is still available to us as well. And we are hard on the Israelites, but Paul continued to talk about in his letters too, that a lot of what they did in disobedience has been set as an example for us so that we don't have to walk into these types of things ourselves. To your point, we do have a lot of the answers available to us already. Why so easily do we let some of these disciplines and obedience go in our lives?
So I like to think that 2,000 years removed from Jesus, we should be doing better here. But I speak to this a lot, that in a first century community, people would have been probably, you walked down to the road of Emmaus, you jumped in the water, you got baptized, like you checked everything on the beach. You followed the Great Commission to a point. You left and you went and lived in that Jesus community. And I watched The Chosen, and they bring this point out well, that they show people that when they made the decision, they didn't go back to their formal way of living. They were dead to that, and they went and they lived in the community. Do you want to join our community? Get baptized, walk with our community. Every day you're going to eat, drink, you're going to grow the grapes, you're going to harvest the honey, you're going to do this, and you're going to have great conversations every day. And I think 2,000 years later, when I say Satan has done some things to look very luxurious, we live in a very heavenly setting right now. I mean, for the last, whether you think the world's been around for 6,000 or 8,000 years, for the last 8,000 years, the generation we're in right now looks more like heaven than anything else. Yet Satan has used that to deter us farther from heaven than maybe any other time in history.
So I think one of the big heartbeats that that you and I both share is ultimately not seeing other people live out the kingdom calling that is within their life, but also doing this within community. Like this is again what we believe that the church is, and even what the Israelites had the opportunity to do was again represent God in a lost and broken world. And could we represent him? This is a big question. Could we represent him in such a profound way that we wouldn't even have to say words? That the way that we lived our lives, the fruit that was produced within our lives, within our relationships, could speak to such an incredible God, or about such an incredible God to this world.
So that's my heartbeat, and I think I want to kind of go back to that liminal space for a second. I think that was coined by Richard Rohr, and a lot of people have talked about it since. It's one of those things I'm not even sure who to give the credit to, but I'd like to give it to somebody. So at some point, it's this place, and I think the threshold is part of the Latin root going on in there. I am not good at Latin. Give me Hebrew, give me Greek, but forget the Latin. And so I think there's a tie to threshold in the language there, but it's basically, think of it spiritually as we're in the cosmos of one dominion to the other. Mm-hmm. And so you think of TOV and Rohr, there's transitional moments, transitional rooms, transitional space. There's sacred and there's not. Mm-hmm. And which one are you going to choose? Are you going to make a cognitive decision for the sacred? And this happens all the time. I think yesterday you when you talked about this, you gave this great list of people and their examples of the Bible of they were in these positions, and yet God came to them and they stepped into that space, and that's where they landed.
Yep. Again, some of those examples were Abraham leaving his home country and his father's house. And again, he didn't know what was on the other side of that. This is our challenge. My prayer is that as you're hearing this too, you're realizing that you may be in a liminal space, or maybe in multiple spaces like this, where you just seems to be a transition period. I think what the Lord is offering is to not rush through that, is to allow him to train and equip in that season to meet him there. But again, it was Joseph in the pit. It was the Israelites in that space. It was Jonah in the belly of the fish. It could even have been Mary weeping at Jesus's tomb. Like, I heard what he said. Yeah. Like I heard the words that came out of his mouth, but he's dead. Yeah. Like when is this going to change, if it's going to change, and what may it look like?
It's interesting that before Paul taught yesterday, we had this group of kids that just put together things, and we just let these kids go. Like, we don't plan any of this. It's kind of like they make the PowerPoint, they show up, they just play their things, and like, it's so funny, the world of church programming, which actually Paul lives deeply in sometimes in his life, but like I don't. I'm the wild one over here of just whatever, and let the Holy Spirit take care of it. And so these kids came and they played, what's the name of that song? Do you hear what is
yeah.
This song that's like from our era, it's something we would have sang in high school youth group, and it's talking about when Rome made these decisions that impacted the Jews, and they couldn't do anything about it. Like if they rose up or did anything, that was Barabbas rose up and went against the Jews, and look how that ended up for him. Well, he did get freed, but eventually he died again. So anyway, the Jews would dance on the streets. They would go out and they would the song has a line, and it says like dancing of injustice. Mm-hmm. And like they would go out and dance as almost like a sense of rebellion. And I do believe some people were just dancing in rebellion, but then some people were out there dancing because they were giving it back to the Lord, saying, your ways are higher than mine. We're just going to trust you through this. And like, that is a great liminal space decision. Mm-hmm. Just to saying, this is what we're going to do. This is the posture of our heart, is to go this way. And all these things that Paul mentioned, Mary, Jonah, Israelites wandering, like they're all at the threshold.
Yeah.
And today, even though I believe some of us coming out of that baptismal water, we don't have those threshold moments. What Jesus has done through us is he's formed a life of sanctification. My biggest pet peeve in life is when people get baptized and they don't live like it. Mm-hmm. And I just want to say, like, God had the power to change you just like that. Why are you still living in the raw? Why can't you live the sanctified life that was given to you? And that's one of the reasons why most of you guys listening to this know that I don't buy into total depravity and all of those things, because I think once we come out of the water, we are made to live pure. We're made to be there. And like, if you believe that like Satan has the power to hold you back through these liminal spaces and decisions, you've already lost the victory at the beginning. Like, you got to claim the victory that was given to you, and you got to walk in the pursuit of sanctification, knowing that Jesus has already won that, and that when you keep making these poor decisions over and over in your life, you're Joseph in the pit, choosing to just, you've been dealt the bad cards and you're just going to live there.
Yeah.
Yet that's not what he does.
And again, going back to where we would say, when James says, consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds, or even in this wilderness space, we go right away to look at this as a negative type thing. And even the Israelites, it wasn't long before they complained, although they were receiving God's provision every day.
Yep.
Their decision quickly was to want to go back into slavery. So to your point of seeking to live after that new life that Jesus has won for us, coming out of the waters of baptism, yet we don't choose to live that way, this is signifying we're literally choosing to go back into slavery. And when you put it that way, you would say, why would anybody want to do that? It seems awful.
And I talked about this in TOV last night. This was the big thrust of our conversation, was we need to be in tribal community. Like, if you're not living surrounded by people that think and live this way and live victoriously every day, making TOV decisions, not raw decisions, you need to change your perspective. You need to get to that place. And so you need to have you need to be discipling your 1, your 3, your 12. You need to be discipled by 1, 3, 12. You need to be in a small group every week with those that walk this way. You need accountability people that check in with you daily, hourly, and just say, how you going? How you doing? I mean, in my world, I say I want to walk with those people every day. Now, I do with my family. We homeschool. I see them a lot, but I also have people like Paul coming back into my life. A lot of the problem is that we're not swimming in the Jesus culture.
Yeah.
We're swimming in the world, and we're trying to live in TOV, and that often doesn't work. Yeah. We need to completely dive in and stay there, swim in the Jesus culture. And that's what we lose. That water, that chaos monster, the plan was that God takes what was chaotic and brings order and life and purification and equipping, and turns those dark, starch wilderness areas into beautiful life and lush Eden.
Yeah.
We don't have to stay there. And that's what Ephesians 5:27 kind of talks about, so that he might present the church himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or such a thing, that they might be holy without blemish. That's the way we're supposed to look and walk. Yeah. That's the life of sanctification. We're not supposed to be stuck in the rut of always going back to trying to dig ourselves out of the hole.
Yeah. And I can't help but wonder what type of beauty, if we lived that way, and especially as a collective body of believers swimming with Jesus, what type of impact that wouldn't have on our world.
Brian Zahn talks about that all the time, how we should look. And we do see little pieces of that.
We do. Yep.
I mean, how many people come to TOV and say, I just needed to check this out. Like, the buzz is out there. People like are talking about this. Like, what does this kind of community look like?
Yeah. But then we have to be humble and realize that at least here in America, we're not doing that.
Right.
And the challenging, again, it's having such a profound impact, not just on our kids, but on what could be our grandkids and our entire culture, especially in our political scene. Not to go there at all, but there's so many things that are just a mess, and they seem so far off track. So ultimately, how do we get back to a better version of this? Or could there be a liminal space in our own lives where God is wanting to use this season or this area where we may not have answers as to what's next or what the timing may look like, to build and equip and to disciple us into a better way of living and thinking?
So we've already touched on some of this, but coming down to the finish of this, I want to finish strong and say, what does it look like? And Paul last night challenged people to don't wait anymore. Make these decisions today. Like, most of you are stuck on the threshold. You're teetering on these thresholds. You're trying to decide which way to go. it's Joshua's word. Choose today whom you're going to serve.
Yeah.
And I mean, this has been the message for thousands of years. And there has been a remnant that's gone this way.
Yeah.
But like if we're going to regain, we're going to renew the fallen, broken, lost world, like it's got to start with the army of us making these positive decisions on a more routine, daily, hourly basis. And I think, to me, like the quick answer, the healed immediately answer would be move into Jesus communities. Like, boy, I think if your family and my family, if we bought a lake and we all built houses around the lake with the sanctuary over here, and we just said we're going to go to work with each other, we're going to build beautiful bookshelves. Paul built the bookshelf behind me. Like, this is what we're going to do. I think it would look very different than the world that we live in today. But it can start with all kinds of different things in that. It can start with family devotions. It can start with aligning into discipleship patterns, into tribal thinking of Jesus over everything in your household. We sing those tunes, we talk about it, but do we actually do it?
Yeah.
The perseverance is, now that you know, let's make decisions to go this way. Fill up your mind, fill up your heart, fill up your life with decisions that look like TOV, not Rohr.
One thing I alluded to last night, and I'll say it again, is regardless of what I've spoken over myself, maybe what you've spoken over yourself, I'm still going to believe what Scripture says is that we were made in His image,
Yes.
and to bear His character traits in this world. So although we're challenging to step up or just to make that final decision, to say I'm completely all in, I don't even know what it's going to look like on the other side of it. The best part is we're designed to live out who He is, and the best way for us to do that is to be able to get to know Him more, to study, and to be willing to be trained and equipped, possibly in a wilderness season. This may be where He wants to meet us right now.
The big thrust of Jesus was to make disciples. And I think that when we talked about Satan kind of taking things that look close, is that I think one of the hard things is that most of our churches that you go to today, and I don't want to necessarily pick on any, I'll say we're all sort of guilty of this. We say we're going to make disciples, and I think if Satan has been victorious in anything here, it's convincing the church that they are making disciples when they're not. And so I think what we're looking at is what does it look like to make better disciples, to walk in discipleship traits? And so I'll leave you with this verse. I am the true vine and my Father is the gardener. I love this. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, He prunes. It's really about bearing fruit. And I think that to do that, we conceptually need to live in a discipleship culture, and I don't think most of us do. So how do we build a discipleship culture? May the Lord bless you and keep you.